or maybe not very many people, have heard of Helga Estby. And there's a reason for that. We're going to find out about the reason. She was born Helga Johansson, and she was 11 years old when her family came to America, and they settled in Michigan in a very tight-knit Norwegian community. But it was also a place where everyone was outspoken about all kinds of issues of the day, suffrage movement, just whatever. And so she grew up pretty independent-minded. The circumstances of her pregnancy at age 15 are not known, but she was quickly married off to 28-year-old Ole Estby. And he was not the father of her daughter Clara, which was kept secret until Clara was grown. Well, they homesteaded on the Minnesota prairie, and she worked alongside Ole in the fields and just considered herself part of the farming operation. While continually pregnant, it almost seemed like during those years. Finally, the blizzards and the drought and all of that got to them, and they relocated to Spokane, Washington. And their next community was more diverse ethnically, and so she insisted that Ole learn English, which he had not until that time. And she forbade the speaking of Norwegian in their home. She joined in all kinds of community affairs. She was very outgoing, and one time fell on the streets of Spokane and injured herself, and she sued the city. This was just not done. Women didn't put themselves forward in that way in those times, but she did, and she won her case. So that was kind of unusual. It gives you an idea of the fact that she really didn't care what people thought. And her health wasn't good after that, but she had some surgery and later was able to bear several more children. They moved to outside of Spokane to a farm, and during that time it was very economically tight for everyone, and so Ole went to work as a carpenter, and she took in sewing, all kinds of things that she could do to help out. They feared foreclosure. She was pregnant with her 11th child at the time. Well, it so happened that Ole was injured in an accident and disabled, and so they were really panicked about foreclosure. Then there came a really strange situation, an offer from a anonymous benefactor in New York City. If Helga and her 18-year-old daughter Clara would walk unescorted from Spokane to New York City, wearing the new bicycle skirts that were being promoted for women's health, they would be paid $10,000. Wow, she saw this as a chance to save the farm. And then the thing about the bicycle skirts was kind of important for her too, because there was a saying at the time, those skirts were a little above ankle length, which was pretty shocking for that time. And the ladies were fond of saying that until a woman could have ankles, there would be no hope for her brains. And so this idea of promoting that kind of thing, as well as the chance to save the farm, really took her attention, and against the advice of everybody in the community and her family and everybody, she went for it. Well, there was what if, people would say to her, what if you meet unscrupulous men? What will you do about that? Where will you sleep? What will you eat? All of those concerns. And what about the family? Well, she said, Ole can take care of the younger kids and the older ones can farm, and we'll be home by Christmas. The terms were kind of interesting. They were to take nothing but $5 and the clothes on their backs. They had to complete the trip in 7 months. They couldn't accept rides. They had to take papers to have signed by the mayors and governors of different places where they would pass to prove that they had actually been there. And so on May 12th, 1896, the two walked out of Spokane, armed with all kinds of notebooks. They were going to take notes. She was hoping to write a book and give lectures and all of that when this was all done. And they decided to go along the railroad tracks. I think somewhere along here, I think Deb has a map of their route. Maybe she'll show later. And so that made their shoes wear out because of the cinders on the tracks, but it was a way to keep from getting lost. They did meet some kind of strange characters, but they carried guns, and those men were easily discouraged. They slept in section houses. Sometimes a farmer or rancher would offer them the barn to sleep in, or maybe even invite them into the house for a meal. And they sold their autograph and their picture along the way to earn money or whatever. When they ran out of money, they just stopped where they were and offered to do whatever work was at hand. It was an interesting time, a lot of range wars and political unrest. It was an election year. Of course, the suffrage movement was going on, and so Helga favored William Jennings Bryan for president, and Clara was for McKinley. So they had some interesting discussions, perhaps not quite as raucous as the ones we've been hearing recently, but they did manage to, they were entertained in the Bryan home in Lincoln, and they met the McKinleys in Ohio. There was a sprained ankle that happened with Clara, and that delayed them a little bit, but they did walk into New York City on December 23rd, 18 days past the deadline. And the sponsor refused to pay or even give them train fare home. So here they are, homeless and destitute on the streets of New York City. Well, they did what they'd done all the time, just whatever work came to hand to put food in their mouths and shelter over them and try to save up for money enough for train fare home. But they couldn't get ahead. And just no matter what they did and struggled, they just barely got by. And then they had word that a 12-year-old daughter, Bertha, had died of diphtheria. And that made Helga desperate. She finally put her pride aside and applied for public assistance. And the newspapers picked it up, and a railroad official came through and offered them passage home. So they got back into Spokane on May 4th, almost a year to the day from the time they'd left, to the news that a son, Johnny, had also died. Well, Helga, of course, was devastated. She became a recluse in her grief and had no interest in any of the things she used to care about. But the worst thing was that the whole community shunned her and the rest of the family. And she was never allowed again to speak of that journey, even within the family. They never mentioned it, and she wasn't allowed to. Eventually, she regained her equilibrium a little bit and became interested again in community affairs. But if she wanted to have discussions about anything controversial, she had to leave home and go downtown to meet her friends there because it wasn't allowed. So she was pretty well disquelched. The worst thing about it was that all of her daughters, maybe not the worst thing, but I thought it was very remarkable, all of her grown daughters refused to vote for the rest of their lives, which must have been a huge disappointment for Helga. Ole died in 1913, and she lived on in a house that there were 2 grown unmarried children and 2 orphan grandchildren. She kept a little private room upstairs where she painted and wrote and entertained the grandchildren with stories. And she always said, take care of grandma's stories, especially the granddaughter Thelma. Well, that was fine, but Thelma didn't really know what stories exactly she was supposed to keep, but she agreed to do that. Helga died in 1942, and her family burned the papers. And a daughter-in-law, during that process, found a clipping about the journey. And she had not any idea about it. She'd never been told. But she knew it must be important, so she kept that clipping. And after her husband died, 26 years later, she gave the clipping to Thelma, which is why we know Helga's story today. And I just found it fascinating how she had been silenced all her life. Wondered, you know, what did she think about at the end of her life? Did she have regrets? How did she feel about it? And I just think that her spirit must have been strong enough that she didn't let the shame that people tried to put on her devastate her for the rest of her life. But I wanted to write a poem in her voice, and this is what I hope she was thinking and how she must have felt about it. And this is called Counting the Cost. Youth rushes heedless and headlong at life, spends a coin of passion and promise as if there were no tomorrow. Youth takes the day by the throat, hangs on, demands decisions, discounts doubt, insensitive to sacrifice and sorrow, always short-sighted in outrunning regret. Midlife marches boldly, goes for broke, finds its own voice, stands up, speaks out, steps over pride, will not be discreet. Living on purpose lengthens the stride, evens the breathing, and strengthens believing in windfalls, justice, and making ends meet. But midlife mistakes left scars that linger yet. Time tempers the ego and slows the step. There's no hurry now. I've gotten good at waiting and found there's strength in silence too. Even shame and sadness, if they're squarely met. Some silence is chosen, some is imposed. But a story untold is nonetheless true, and I've written it down so they won't forget. There was meaning in the things we did, and things that matter must never be hid. This is the truth I am sure of today. It matters, no matter what they say or don't. It doesn't cost much to be good. I ransomed their rules for more than I should and paid full price. I owe no debt. So hopefully that's how she felt about it. Hopefully she made peace with all the trials and the silencing that went on in her life. So I'm going to turn it over to Deb now, and she's going to tell you about somebody that was also pretty proud of stepping over the line.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lyn. And for our participants, as you have questions, you can type them into the chat box, or you can wait till the end and ask Lyn and I then, and we can try to answer any questions that you might have. Like Lyn said, I'm going to tell you about Pearl Taylor Hart. And I did a little bit of research on her. There's a lot of things that are, I would say, myth or legend as opposed to factual information, and sometimes it's hard to distinguish between the two. And so I kind of did my best to find that line there. But I thought that her mother must have had high hopes when she named this first daughter Pearl. And the family lived in Ontario, Canada. Mrs. Taylor sent Pearl to good schools in the early 1880s, but her hopes for her daughter must have been dashed when Pearl fell in love with Frederick Hart in 1888. Frederick wasn't the kind of young man that you would want your daughter to fall in love with. He was a drinker, he was a gambler. One of his life's ambitions was to be a bartender in Chicago. So he and Pearl ran off to Chicago, and he found work not as a bartender, but as a sideshow barker. Pearl saw various Wild West shows, and she fell in love with those depictions of the Old West. Eventually, she ran off with a cowboy. They got as far as Denver, and this cowboy left her when she realized that she was pregnant with Frederick's child. So she returned to her family in Canada, and after giving birth to a son, she left the boy with her mother, and she returned out west. When she was out west, she worked in mining camps where she fed the miners. She also fed her own addictions. She worked her way south, finally got back together, or eventually got back together with Hart. They had a daughter, but they separated again in 1898, which was a decade after they first fell in love. He left her. He enlisted in the Army to fight with Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders in Cuba, and Pearl returned to Canada with the two children. But after a couple of months, she got the itch to go west again, and this time went southwest to Arizona mining camps. And there she met a man by the name of Joe Boot. I love these names, Frederick Hart, Joe Boot. So she and Joe ran a lot of scams together, and one of their favorite ones was she lured men up to her room, and Joe would be waiting there to rob them. But she received they said that the mom was ill. There's another letter from her brother, and her mother needed some money for her medical bills. And so she and Joe decided they needed to make a little bit more money. So they decided to rob the Benson Globe stagecoach. So they stood outside on the road outside of Florence, Arizona, stopped the stage. They robbed the passengers, and they got over a little over $400. I thought this was funny. The travelers were so put out with them that they made such a fuss that Pearl gave them back each $1 so they could buy their lunch. And then the two robbers mounted their horses and rode off, crisscrossed their tracks for 2 days, trying to lose a posse that they figured would come after them. And that at the end of those days, they were so exhausted that they went to sleep under a tree. When they woke up, the posse was surrounding them, and they realized that they were just a quarter of a mile from where they started. So they weren't very efficient in hiding their tracks. I'm going to share another slide with you. This is the mugshots of the two. When they were tried, Joe was found guilty. He received 30 years in prison. He eventually escaped and was never heard from again. But Pearl's trial was in Florence in November 1899, and I thought her defense was very good. She said that the court had no right to place her on trial. And in her words, she said, "I shall not consent to be tried under a law in which my sex had no voice in making." She did admit her guilt, though, and drew on their empathy by relating their story that her mother needed money for medical bills, and so the jury acquitted her. The judge wasn't very happy with the jury. He had Pearl retried, this time for unlawfully carrying a gun, and instructed the jury not to be bent to her will. This time she was sentenced to 5 years in Yuma Territorial Prison. So her time there was spent doing a variety of activities. Sometimes she played the lady bandit and was real rough and tough and had some pictures taken of her in that pose. And at other times she presented herself as a young lady who had all the qualities of young ladyhood. And she would practice those fine arts of tatting lace, of writing plays and poems. And so she met with all kinds of admirers. The only time she gave private interviews that we know of was to a Christian minister and also to the governor of Arizona. She requested an audience with the governor because she wanted to be famous. This fame appealed to her, and she was seeking a parole or a pardon so that she could play herself as a lady bandit. I think her sister and she were writing that play together. But she didn't get the pardon right away. But pretty soon, these rumors started circulating that she was pregnant. Now remember that the only private interviews she gave were to this Christian minister and the governor of Arizona. So shortly after these rumors started, she was paroled by Governor Brody, and it was on the condition that she leave Arizona and never return. So on December 19th, 1902, Pearl left the prison after serving 18 months of her 5-year sentence. And the official reason was overcrowding. So I thought that was interesting, okay? At the time, there were 5 women prisoners in Yuma. There was a young guard who was assigned to her to escort her to the train, and he knew all about her background as a lady bandit. But when they asked him if he thought that she was guilty of this crime, he replied that she was mild-mannered, ladylike, and he didn't think that she had the sand to commit this crime. But her name was Pearl, okay? The world was her stage, the world was her oyster, and I think that we all know she had plenty of sand to do this. So I kind of took that idea and started this song and fiddled with it a lot before it turned out the way I liked it. And this is just Pearl Hart's life, okay? At 17, a tender age, Pearl Taylor chased her heart.
all the way to Illinois, where he lost all his charm. She went out west to prove the test, to search for untamed land, and vowed to keep the upper hand when dealing with a man. Fair pearls are made from coarse grains, and the world in a shell is a stage. But no matter how you paint it, how you polish, how you shine, a bit of sand's a bit of sand, no matter how refined. Girl moved to Arizona and lost her heart to boot. She robbed the old bloke stagecoach and made off with the loot. But they got lost and they got caught and they got sent to jail. And Pearl was given 5 years in a Yuma prison cell. Fair pearls are made from coarse grains, and the world in a shell is a stage. But no matter how you paint it, how you polish, how you shine, a bit of sand's a bit of sand, no matter how refined. Well, she spent her confinement writing poems and writing plays, making friends and making lace, and making her own way. She got the governor's pardon and a fair pair of white gloves. She left the stage an actress in a role she'd grown to love. Fair pearls are made from coarse grains, and the world in a shell is a stage. But no matter how you paint it, how you polish, how you shine, a bit of sand's a bit of sand, no matter how refined. Yes, Pearl Hart had a bit of sand, no matter how refined.
So that's Pearl's story. I'm going to put the guitar down and take it back to Lyn. Okay, and remember, if you have questions and you want to ask those at the end, or you can type them in the chat box. Either way, we'd love to hear your questions. Okay, Lyn's going to tell you a little bit about
Yeah, yes, this is baby Doe Tabor, and she was a little more notorious than Helga, so most of you may have at least heard her name. She was born Elizabeth McCourt in 1855 in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and she was the prettiest of 6 siblings, and a lot like the other 2 ladies we've talked about today, just sort of willful, and she was tomboyish and liked to draw attention to herself. When she was a young woman, she won a skating contest, a figure skating contest that was sponsored by the local church. And that was kind of a daring thing for a young woman to put herself forward in that way. She likely was the only female in that contest, but she won it and also won the attention of Harvey Doe. And they were soon married, and they moved to Central City, Colorado, where Harvey was to work in a silver mine that his father had half interest. Well, Harvey was sort of shiftless. He didn't care much for mining, and they had to eat. So Lizzie put on the miner clothes and picked up the tools, and she went to work in the mine herself, which of course scandalized the women of the community, but the miners loved it, and they nicknamed her Baby immediately. Well, eventually she decided to divorce Harvey, and it was probably about the time or shortly after she met Horace Tabor. He was a wealthy silver miner from Leadville, and he had struck it rich along with a partner. After coming from Maine, his wife Augusta had followed him all the way from Maine, and they had been a while in several different states, and he tried his hand at a lot of different things and failed at everything. So she was kind of upset with him, and she had the marriage was strained. And especially because now that he was rich, he wanted to live in a lavish lifestyle, and she wasn't so much in favor of that, probably thinking they better keep something for a rainy day given his history. So they were at odds anyway, and when he met Baby, she was a little more willing to share his good fortune, one might say, and they carried on a not very discreet affair. He asked Augusta for a divorce, and she refused, so he went to St. Louis and obtained a bogus divorce, and they were secretly married. None of that was probably on the up and up legal, but it didn't matter. Eventually, Augusta did give him a divorce, and they moved to Washington, D.C., where Horace pursued a short political career, and they had a lavish wedding there. Then they came back to Denver, but again, a lot like Helga, the community sort of shunned him. He was viewed as a cradle robber, and she as a gold digger, and so people didn't really admit him into polite society very much, but they didn't really care. It really was a love match, and they had 3 children, a son that was stillborn, and then 2 daughters. The daughters didn't have very happy lives. One of them became an alcoholic and addict and died young in the mining camps, and the other one moved back east and seemed to be estranged from her parents. But they lived on happily for quite a while, and then eventually Horace lost his fortune, but Baby stuck by him. I remember it was a love match, and it wasn't the money that she was after. She enjoyed it while she could, but he said to her, you know, hang on to the matchless mind, because it will pay again. Well, I think that's mostly legend, because he didn't even own it anymore. He became a common laborer in that mine. And when he died, Baby lived on in a shack at the entrance to the mine by the courtesy of the owner. And she was probably young enough and pretty enough at that point that she could have remarried, but chose not to. So you see the shack there where she lived. She was found frozen to death in that shack on March 7th, 1935. So it's a bittersweet story. And again, I wanted to know what she was thinking, but in this case, it was early in life that I wanted to get into her head, and at the time that she maybe met Horace, and all her dreams were fresh and new, and life was an adventure to be grabbed and run away with. And so this is a poem in Baby's voice. It's called, well, what else? Staking a Claim. I will have that man, you know, sooner rather than later, I think. Oh, I'm accustomed to come hither glances and that quicken the heart and turn cheeks pink, but there was that in his manner when he tipped his hat and held my hand a bit too long that said, we're on the edge of adventure, risky, but glorious and grand. Now, unlike Harvey, he's not averse to work, nor am I. I hear his worry-minded wife clings to pinching purse strings and refuses to embrace a life enhanced by pleasures well earned. Why, any fool with half an eye can see here's a man with hungers needing to be fed and on the edge of asking to be free. Augusta's plain face, lacking in laughter. He has the means to alleviate both, but she's plain in taste too, and loath to let go. Sachet and style, arrayed in diamonds, velvet, and mink. So I will have that man, you know, and sooner rather than later, I think. So I'm going to turn it back over to Deb now. She has one more story for us.
Okay, thank you, Lyn. We're going to shift to our Nebraska author, Mari Sandoz. And so some of you are probably familiar with Mari. And let's go to the next slide. She was born in Sheridan County, and kind of in this area where you can see on the 1899 map of Nebraska. These were her parents, Jules and Mary, or Marie. one of the places that was important to her and her kind of just her life as a writer, beginnings as a writer, was the Peters School. So she went here when she was 9 years old, and it just played that important role. This is where she learned to speak English, where she learned to read, where she learned to write. When she attended there, she won her first award and had her first story published by the Omaha Daily News. And that happened when she was 12 years old. Now, her father, Jules, wasn't as impressed by this award as other people might be. He considered that fiction was for housemaids, not befitting the daughter of an educated man that he was, as you see. And that's being a little bit sarcastic. But as her reward, he locked her in the cellar because he just didn't want her to be a writer. He didn't want her to be common. This was Sheridan County, again, a map here, and we see the Sandoz Niobrara River Homestead Place, and they eventually moved to this claim, the Sandoz Kincaid Claim and Orchard here. And I grew up north of Rushville, which is in here, okay? So this was her Sheridan County. Now, after graduating from the 8th grade, Mari sneaked off the place. She rode her horse into the town of Rushville, 20 miles away, where she took the rural teacher's exam. She passed. Her father was proud of her for passing, and he probably saw the potential of extra income there. So she did work as a teacher. And at the age of 18, she married Ray Maycumber, who was a rancher who neighbored near them. They divorced in 1919, which was pretty much of a scandal too. She cited mental cruelty as the cause, and he actually helped her financially move to Lincoln, which was also a little bit unusual for those times and for the place. She returned to the Sandhills to teach. That was in 1921, and here's a picture of her on the steps of Sidney Grade School in Cheyenne County, which is right next to where I live currently. One day the students came to school only to find a note on the door which said, "No school, teacher gone." And especially during this pandemic, some days I feel like doing that as well. She went back to Lincoln. She took classes there. This was kind of a little bit of an issue because she only had an 8th grade graduation and she wanted to take college classes. She was denied that opportunity, and so she sat outside the dean's office every day for a week until he finally talked to her, and she convinced him that she should be able to take some classes. I don't know whether she had to modify any of her documents or not, but it's kind of interesting that her persistence carried her through that part of her schooling too. She worked a lot of low-paying jobs just to keep herself in food, okay, and rent, and then she wanted to write, and so she wrote. A lot of times she survived on tea and sugar and crackers, very thin, very malnourished. But in 1927, there was a new quarterly called Prairie Schooner, and the first story in the first issue was hers, Marie Maycumber, and it was called The Vine. Now, her father often told her that he didn't appreciate her writing. He at one time told her too that he considered artists and writers the maggots of society. And so you can imagine her surprise when he was on his deathbed in Alliance, and he said, "Well, why don't you write about my life sometime?" And so she did. And this book on her father kind of shattered all of the romantic notions of the West. Before that time, people really romanticized how things were in the West, and she just told it like it was. She won a prize for that book, and then her publisher urged her to change her writing name to Mari Sandoz, and so she did. People in Sheridan County still often think that maybe she was a little above her station for changing her name, and they kind of make fun of her for being Mari rather than her given name Marie. But again, her success as an author is directly attributable to this book, Old Jewels. These are a list of books that she's also known for. Very prolific writer, And again, very perseverant. If one publisher wasn't willing to look at it, she would just go through the list of publishers and then start at the beginning again if she was rejected for all of the publishers. At that time, New York didn't have as many as we do today. But she did move to New York to be closer to those publishers. When she was 58 years old, this was in May of 1954, she had surgery for breast cancer. And she wrote up to the last minute before she was taken into surgery. She was at the top of her game, like the slide says, and she followed this tour that she had set up, and so she just didn't feel like she could quit. She did, however, go home. She knew that the old military doctors had tried to heal people's wounds by allowing them to soak up the sunshine and be in the wind and to dry up those wounds. And so she did that. She went to the sandhills. She was out in the sunshine with her bare chest, and she let the wind and the sun heal her. Unfortunately, though, about 10 years later, in January 1964, she had the other breast removed. And then later that year in October, she discovered that the cancer had spread to her bones. She continued to write, even though it was painful. She was hospitalized in March, and when she came out of the hospital, she was a recluse, but she worked on those proofs of her latest book right up to the last minute. She wanted to get that done. And that was February of 1966. She had to return to the hospital, and she died later. Her body was brought back to Nebraska. You can see the hill on the left here where she's buried. Now, another story that I heard, I don't know if this is accurate, but I think the story says her wishes were that she wanted to be buried at the top of the hill. But it was a wet spring, and in March, and her brothers got her in the wagon as far as here, and they said, this is good enough. And so they dug her grave, and that's where she is. You can visit it. It is on private ground, but a lot of people do go up to her grave site, and there's a little cache there as well that you can, take out in your notebook and write your name down and do that geocaching while you're there. And then there's a drive through to the orchard as well. If you haven't been out in the Sandhills, I'd encourage you to go. It's just beautiful. And Lyn can tell you more about that, because that's her country too, is the Sandhills. In her lifetime, she published 22 books, numerous short stories and essays. And she was respected as a historian, a writer, a storyteller. She was also an advocate for Native American rights when that wasn't popular. So I appreciate that about her a great deal. When I worked on the reservation at Ogallala Lakota College and at Pine Ridge High School for some time. And I just, like I said, just admire that about her, that she was an advocate for Native American rights. And I wanted to write a song that honored her. And so this is part of the lyrics you'll see up on the screen here. And this is her book, Off to the Side, Love Song to the Plains. But the song itself is called Everything Goes in a Circle.
She wrote about the seasons of life, winter, spring, summer, and fall. Her love songs to the plains were seen through the birth and death of all. And oh, she looked at a drop of water and saw the way it worked on the sand. She brought that drop of water to the ocean and all the lands. Man affects nature, and nature affects man. And everything goes in a circle according to a greater plan. To sustain the people's life, the red man ate the buffalo. When the red man died, his bones fed the earth and helped the grass to grow. Oh, oh, she looked at a drop of water and saw the way it worked on the sand. She brought that drop of water to the ocean and all the land. Man affects nature, and nature affects man. And everything goes in a circle according to a greater plan. A fruit tree starts from a seed and grows to bloom in the spring. The fruit it bears produces more seed, and the cycle starts again. And oh, she looked at a drop of water and saw the way it worked on the sand. She brought that drop of water to the ocean and all the lands. Man affects nature, and nature affects man. And everything goes in a circle according to a greater plan.
So that was for Mari Sandoz. Thank you. So if you have any questions, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the participant and chat and everything a little bit better, and you can see us. Any questions at all? Except for from my kitty cat who wants to go outside. Sorry if you can hear that.
Well, I have a question for you, Deb and Lyn. You said that you were inspired by this quote to like go out and share the stories of some of these women, and obviously you live really close to where Marie Sandoz lived. But these other ladies, did you just go out and like just find some books about it, or like how? What about these other three ladies like really inspired you to write or to share these stories?
Well, I'll answer a little bit and let Lyn take it from there too, but we had been reading various things. You know, I had my stack of books that I was reading, and Lyn reading hers. We had a couple other programs that we had researched for. And, you know, names would pop up and we would say, oh, you know, that's kind of interesting. And so that's kind of where I came from with Pearl Hart. Mari Sandoz was actually one of the ladies that I had written about in another program or for another program. And so she just sort of dovetailed and fit into this one as well. Lyn, how about you?
Well, I love the research part, and I've always found that I know I want to end up with writing a poem about whatever character it is, but when I'm researching, it's hard to make myself stop, because there's always another rabbit hole to go down, something else to find out, and so that part's always fascinated me. But oftentimes it was with Baby Doe. You know, I'd heard of her but never knew too much about her, just that she was supposed to be kind of a bad girl, naughty girl, and that fascinated me, and so I wanted to learn more. Began to do some research there. With Helga, I'm a great reader, and I hang out in bookstores a lot. They love to see me coming, and so I came upon a book about Helga's life in our local bookstore in Valentine, and saw that and thought, oh, I've got to read this woman's story, and that's how I got hooked with Helga. But it's just it's always just interesting to pick up a character and find out more about the secret side of their lives. Other questions?
I see that we have a question or a comment from Kathy Richmond. And Kathy says, I write inspirational romance, and I'm finding the heroine's story is about coping with the contradictions of society's expectations. It's not so much that they're poorly behaved, but that society's expectations were impossible. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. We kind of have that lighthearted look at not so well behaved women, but yeah, exactly. Those expectations were impossible. Lyn, what do you want to add to that?
I agree totally. The fact that they were ahead of their time, basically, in a way. All of the women that we've written about, and some of the others that really accomplished some things of note, but were ostracized for putting themselves forward in the time when they lived. So I think that's been a theme that I've noticed.
Good, thank you. And thank you, Kathy. Anybody else?